Well, happy Thursday morning, everyone. Welcome back to Morning Musings. My name is Don K. Preston. I am the president of Preterist Research Institute of Ardmore, Oklahoma. Well, this is video number 4 in our initiation of our study of 1 Corinthians chapter 15. I'm sharing with you the importance of setting the proper context for 1 Corinthians chapter 15. I read one time of a very famous preacher. He was chided somewhat for not quoting 150 or 200 verses in a sermon. But he said, I would rather spend 2 hours setting the proper context for a passage, a single passage, knowing that I had set the proper context and made the proper application, than to quote, than to quote 200 verses and not know whether I was setting the proper context or not. Well, you got to admire that, and that's why it's so important for us to understand the proper context of viewing 1 Corinthians chapter 15. The very first thing that we are establishing, that I'm sharing with you, is that no matter what our concept of the nature of the resurrection might be, as found in 1 Corinthians 15, it must conform to Paul's oft-repeated statement in Acts and in other passages, and right here in 1 Corinthians 15, that his resurrection hope was the hope of Israel, found in Moses, the law, and the prophets. Now here's why this is important. In at least 8 formal public debates in which I have engaged, and numerous, countless private discussions that I have had, I have asked my amillennial and postmillennial friends and disputants, is your eschatological hope based upon the yet future fulfillment of God's Old Covenant promises made to Old Covenant Israel? Without exception, every single one of those individuals, whether postmillennialists such as Joel McDermott in my 2012 debate with him, he said, no. My eschatological hope is based upon Adam and Abraham. God was through with Israel at the cross. The same is true in my debate with Steve Gregg. The same is true in my debate with John Welch, Mac Deaver, and on and on and on it goes. My most recent formal public debate, July 2016, with Dr. David Hester of Faulkner University. He said the same thing that Dr. Joel McDermott did. He said his eschatological hope was Adamic and Abrahamic, not Israel. Now, folks, that is an incredibly bad, false eschatology, because it absolutely flies in the face of Paul's doctrine when he says, I believe all things that are written in the law of Moses, the law and the prophets, that there's about to be the resurrection of the just and the unjust. Where did Paul get his doctrine of the resurrection? Acts 24:13. Acts chapter 26, 5 and following. Paul's hope of the resurrection was the hope of the 12 tribes that they got from the fathers, the Old Covenant fathers. He said that it was Moses and the law, Moses, and the prophets who spoke of the resurrection of Christ, that he would be the first to be raised from the dead. Well, look, if Moses, the law, and the prophets foretold Christ as the first to be raised from the dead, then that means that Moses, the law, and the prophets were predicting the resurrection, because Christ is the first fruit of the resurrection. Now, what is absolutely critical to understand. Number one, Paul said he had one eschatological hope. He did not have an Adamic resurrection hope delineated from an Abrahamic resurrection hope, delineated from the hope of Israel found in Moses, the law, and the prophets. I challenge and have challenged any of my debate opponents to show us distinctly and clearly anywhere in the Bible where there is a distinction, a delineation, and a dichotomy between an Adamic, Abrahamic resurrection versus the hope of Israel. In my debate with Joel McDermott, found in this book, End Times Dilemma Fulfilled or Future, he said there was a distinction between Abrahamic eschatological resurrection hope versus that of Israel. I challenged him to prove it. All he attempted to do was appeal to Job chapter 19. We'll have more to say about Job 19 as we proceed. But here's the really weird thing. Here's the really powerful thing that you must see. If the promise of the resurrection of Job 19 is the ultimate resurrection hope, it's Abraham's hope, and it's Adamic hope, why is it that not once in any of his writings about resurrection, not in Philippians chapter 3, not in 1 Thessalonians 4 and 5, not in 2 Thessalonians chapter 1, not in 1 Corinthians 15, not in 2 Corinthians 3 through 5, none, not in one single text does Paul ever appeal to, cite, or directly echo Job. Never. What does he do? He quotes God's Old Covenant promises made to Old Covenant Israel, found in Isaiah, found in Hosea, found in Daniel, found in Ezekiel. Well, wait a minute. I thought those were promises, as we saw in the last video, made to Old Covenant Israel, Israel after the flesh. And by the way, Paul in 1 Corinthians chapter 15 said that when the resurrection of 1 Corinthians 15 would be fulfilled, it would be in fulfillment of Isaiah 25 verse 8. Well, is that Job or not? It's a promise made to Old Covenant Israel after the flesh. And it would be the fulfillment of Hosea 13 and verse 14. Well, is Hosea the promise of God made to Job and not to Israel? Really? No, there is no dichotomy. Now, in closing, got to get to this, and you got to catch the power of this. In 1 Corinthians 15, we find conflated together Adamic resurrection promise, Abrahamic resurrection promise, and God's promises to Old Covenant Israel conflated. Number one, 1 Corinthians chapter 15, verse 22. As in Adam all men die, even so in Christ shall all be made alive. There's your Adamic resurrection hope. It's pretty clearly not different from Paul's resurrection hope that he is iterating here in 1 Corinthians 15. If it was different, why did he bring it up and link it to the very thing he's expecting? Number two, the resurrection hope that he is talking about here is the ultimate resurrection, i.e. the final resurrection. It is the resurrection to be found in the new creation, Hebrews chapter 11 to 16, and verse 35. New heaven, new earth, better resurrection. And finally, it is the resurrection hope of Israel, because the resurrection that Paul's discussing in 1 Corinthians 15 would be fulfilled when Isaiah 25:8 was fulfilled, and when Daniel 12 was fulfilled, verse 2, and when Hosea 13, verse 14 was fulfilled. So what does that mean? It means that just like Hebrews chapter 11 shows, the hope of the resurrection from Abel to Abraham, Abel, Enoch, Noah, Abraham, was carried forward all the way through Moses. And when did Paul say that resurrection hope, as in Adam all men die, even so shall all be made alive? When did Paul say that ultimate Abrahamic resurrection hope would be realized? It would be when Isaiah 25:8 and Hosea 13:14 and Daniel 12 and Ezekiel 37 were fulfilled. But wait a minute, that's the hope of Israel. That means the Adamic resurrection hope was assimilated into the Abrahamic resurrection hope, which in turn was assimilated into Israel's eschatological hope. There is one eschatological hope. There is not an Adamic resurrection promise distinct from Abrahamic resurrection promise and hope, distinct from Israel's resurrection hope. We'll have more to say about that come Monday. Thank you so much for joining me for this morning's morning musings. Don't forget, order the book, Exegetical Essays on the Resurrection by Sam Frost, normally $17.95, but while I'm doing this study on 1 Corinthians 15, it's not $17.95 plus $4.95 shipping. It is $15 post paid to you. Go to my website, donkpreston.com, order the book, send me an email that you saw the offer on YouTube or Facebook, and your total cost, I'll refund the total cost except $15. The offer is not good overseas. It's not good out of the continental U.S., the lower 48, so to speak. I wish I could. But I will make this available at a reduced price through ebook form, so contact me if you're interested in that. Well, thank you so very, very much for this morning's morning musings. I hope you can see how important it is to establish properly the framework, the context for understanding 1 Corinthians 15 and the resurrection. It is not a promise made to the church divorced from Israel. It is the iteration of God's and explanation of God's Old Covenant promises made to Old Covenant Israel after the flesh to be fulfilled, to be realized when her promises were fulfilled. Lord willing, we'll see you on Monday. You have a fantastic weekend.